Let us pray. Father, I thank you for your word, the living word which comes down to us from above. Let us have ears to hear it and hearts that yearn to obey, that you might be glorified and that we might live lives worthy of God, to be called a godly people. Amen. Well, as I was asking the children, how many of you have ever been called to change something? And by that I mean called to change. I don't mean I'd rather wear a red jumper today than a blue jumper. I mean something significant, something substantive, and most often something that you don't want to do, or maybe you think is too hard to do. Maybe there's something in your life right now that you're thinking needs to change. Have you got something to fill that blank space? You don't have to tell me or anyone else, because you know it on your heart. There's things that we always need to change, because God is always about the business of growing us into his people. We can never rest content because God always has something more for us. But we have to have ears to hear and a heart that is willing to obey and follow that call to change. Again, it's a call to change that God is ever moving us forward. And that's exactly what happened literally and figuratively to the people of Israel in this story from the book of Joshua. Now, some of you will be familiar with the story that Moses had led the people out of Egypt, out of slavery. He'd led them for 40 years in the desert with the promise that God had prepared a promised land for them, the land of Israel, a land flowing with milk and honey. And Moses had led them to the east side of the Jordan River, because the land on the west, almost like the West Bank today, is the beginning of the promised land for the people of Israel. And he told Moses to go and climb a hill and look out to the west, because that was the view of the promised land that he had. But what we have today is God's succession plan, because Moses died there on the mountain and is buried there to this day. And the person that was Moses' lieutenant, the second in command, was this young fellow named Joshua, a man who was filled with the passion of the Lord and a call to lead the people. It was a significant shift in the kind of leadership that was needed. Moses was an administrator, he was a guide in the wilderness, but Joshua was called as a warrior. He was called as a general, and I'll explain to you why that was. So here they were on the east side of the Jordan River, and God was saying to them, the promised land is on the west side of the river. And he was calling them to pack up their tents, to move their animals, to carry their children, and to go and claim the promised land. Not an easy job, because it was full of the ites, the Girgashites and the Gibeonites and all the ites, all different kinds of people. The land was already populated, and in order to go and take the land, they had to go and take it from the people who were there. Now, this is one of God's inscrutable acts of judgment. We don't understand what happened to all the ites, except that many of them were killed and the rest of them were driven off the land. This was the job that was before them. They had every reason to be afraid of that job. And thirdly, they had reason to think it was impossible, because these were people who were wandering Arameans. They were wandering in the desert. They were not warriors, but God had called them to that task. And in addition, there was a barrier in front of them, because the River Jordan was at that point at flood stage. It was at a high point. They were on the east side, and they needed to go to the west side. And they must have surely wondered when Joshua called them and said, "It's time to go, folks." They must have wondered, how on earth are we going to get across that river? So you say, the promised land is over there, but have you not seen the fearsome stage of this river? So Joshua was calling them to a hard task. First of all, he was calling them to leave their comfort. He was calling them to leave their comfort. We describe that today as being called out of our comfort zones. And what is a comfort zone? It's a place you're familiar with. It's a place where you know people. It's a place where you know what to expect when you go to work on a Monday or turn up for a game on a Saturday. It's a place where you understand the relationships, where you are known, sometimes respected and liked. It's a place where you don't have to worry about what's coming next. You know the drill. You are habituated to a particular place of comfort, and there's nothing at all that's wrong with that. God calls us out of insecurity into security. But sometimes that comes at a cost. We all know how hard we work to establish a level of comfort in our homes, in our communities, enough financial security, enough friends and relationships to feel a sense of comfort. And yet we're still called out of our comfort zones. This is what God was doing with the Israelites. Come on, pack up your tents, gird your loins, let's go. We're going across the Jordan River. Now, he would have found some resistance to that, just as you and I might resist any call to leave our comfort zones. We don't want to. But sometimes God has something more for us. And it means leaving our present comfort in order to find a deeper comfort. And by that, I don't mean a big fat chair to sit in and watch our television. I mean a greater sense of who we are, a greater peace, a greater connection with who we are and who we think we ought to be. That's what God's comfort is. So first of all, they had to overcome their comfort. The second thing they had to do was overcome their fear. Now, as I said, they had to transition from being a desert people, a people who lived in tents, to being a warrior people. The men had to learn to fight. They had to put a sword on their belt. They had to pick up a shield, and they had basically a dirty job that they had to do. They had every reason to be afraid. I can't do this. I don't want to do this. I don't want to be a warrior. And that was what God was calling them to. Now, I'm very thankful that God has never called me to be a warrior. I know he has with some of you, and it must be a fearsome task. But there are nonetheless times where God's calling me, and perhaps God's calling you to make a change that is fearful. It may mean taking a new job. It may mean saying goodbye to a loved one. It may mean confronting someone who's bullying you. It may mean any number of things. We all live with fears. But I want to ask you, how many of you are good at imagining the worst case scenario? Yes? There's one, two honest people. Yeah, 3, 4, yes. You know, when my children were late home, I never imagined, they must have missed the last train, or there must have been, they were having too much fun out, and they decided, they're going to... It's always they're in a roadside, they're in a ditch by the roadside, or my daughters have been abducted and they're being abused. It was never anything but the absolute worst case scenario. And we do the same thing when it comes to our fears. We never imagine that we might actually gain rather than lose with a change. We're good at imagining the worst case scenario, but we're not so good at imagining the best case scenario. The best case for the Israelites was that they would no longer be a tent-dwelling people, but they were going to inherit lands. They were going to move into houses. They were going to reap crops that they hadn't sown. Everything was going to be better, but they first of all had to face that fear. They had to face their fear and trust Joshua that after we face that fear, things are actually going to be better than they are now. It's so much easier for us to stay in our comfort with our fear held at bay. But what is God calling us to do? Sometimes God is calling us to step out of our comfort and face our fears. Now, how do we do that? Well, this is where it comes to remembering what God has done in the past. Because very often, what lies in front of us seems impossible. It seems impossible. And that's what the Israelites were facing. They were looking at a river that was in flood stage. That if you stepped into that river, you would drown, you'd be washed away, you would surely die. They must have imagined all their animals, their sheep and their goats would be washed downstream. All their children would be washed downstream. All of them would be washed downstream, because God was calling us not to go around that river or over that river, but through that river. Through the river. How are we going to do that? That seems impossible. Absolutely impossible. And this is when it became so important for them to think back on other impossible situations that they had faced before. Can you think of impossible situations that the Israelite people had faced during those 40 years? First of all, they were slaves. They'd been slaves for 400 years in Egypt. And God sent Moses to say, let my people go. I'm not going to do that. So God sent 10 plagues, the frogs and the gnats and the darkness and all manner of things, the hail and the thunder and light, everything. The river turned to blood. And the will of the Pharaoh was ultimately broken. And they were released from slavery. And then they went into the wilderness. You can imagine that we're going to die out here. We're going to die of thirst. And God told Moses to strike the rock at Meribah, and the water flowed like a river, and they all drank. They said, we're hungry out here as well. And God flew in, literally, quail every day for 40 years, and they ate quail. He gave them manna to eat. And I love there's a passage in the Bible that says, and their sandals never wore out. Do you ever have a pair of shoes that just seems to go on forever? You know, when you get a pair of shoes like that, you think, I'm going to go and buy 2 or 3 pairs of this, and I'm going to put them on the shelf so that when these things do wear out, I'll have a replacement. That's what it says about God, that his provision for them never ended. God was always with them. And so when they were facing this flood stage, think back to the last time that they had faced a flood stage, 40 years earlier. Can you remember what it was? They had water in front of them, Pharaoh's army behind them. You remember what they did? What happened? They went swimming. Yeah, they learned the breaststroke. No, they crossed the Red Sea. That's right. Moses put his hands up and the waters parted. Astonishing miracle. And they walked across on dry ground. That's what they needed to remember when they were faced with something impossible. Now think back in your life. Have you ever been in an impossible situation? Have you ever been made redundant with a family at home that you have to feed? Have you ever had an illness that you thought, there's no way I can deal with this? Have you ever had a broken relationship that you thought, this is the end? Has God ever called you to do something that seems impossible, to break the chains of an addiction, or to take care of your health in a way that you perhaps hadn't done, to confront your fears? Sometimes it's just terrifying just to go outside. And it seems impossible. Which is why it's so important that we think back on those times and those places where life seemed impossible. Do you know what I'm talking about? Am I the only one who's faced impossible odds? Probably not. We've all got those stories that make us who we are. And that's the whole point that God was trying to make with them. Joshua said, up sticks, folks, pack up your tents, round up your herds, get your children in hand, because it's time to go, because by this you will know that the living God is among you. By this you will know. What did he mean by this? He meant by making the move, by stepping out of their comfort zone, by confronting their fear, by remembering God's miraculous provision in the face of other impossible situations. When you do this thing that I have called you to do, when you make this change that is an inner calling, a yearning for something else, when you step out, then you will see that the living God is among you. Not before. Not before. It's only when we take that step that we recognize, oh my God, wow, this is not impossible. I'm not as afraid as I thought I would be, and my comfort was actually just a cheap way of getting by in life, and there may be something more for me at the end of this, because I am seeing the provision and the grace and the mercy and the power of God in this action. By this you will see that the living God is among you. Now, when Paul was writing to the church in Thessalonica, he reminded them of the way that he'd lived among them. And then he has these lovely short words: live a life worthy of God. Live a life worthy of God. What does that mean? It means to have a tender heart that is responsive and willing to listen. To listen. And to do as you're instructed. To pay attention to that deep yearning in your heart. And to do what you're being called to do. To make the changes that you're being called to make. Sometimes it means actually moving. Sometimes it means packing up your belongings and moving to a different place. And some of you have done that. Sometimes it's a behavior that needs to change, or a relationship that needs to change. Sometimes it means staying right where you are and approaching the same problems in a different way, in a way that you know is right but have not done yet. That's what it means to live a life worthy of God, to follow the example of Joshua, to get up. I don't want to do this. This is uncomfortable. This is fearful. This seems impossible. But by this you will know that the living God is among you. You will know that God is with you. I love the story, how it ends. What happened? The priests were called to pick up the Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of the presence of God among them, the throne of God. They carried it with them as in a ceremonial way. And Joshua said, right, lads, go ahead, go into the river. They're like, no, I'm not going. Go into the river. And as soon as they stepped into the waters, not before, but as soon as they put toe in the water, what happened? The waters stacked up. Upriver. They just piled up. What does that look like? I don't know. But the point is that they walked across that river on dry ground. It was a miracle of God's provision. But they wouldn't have known it if they'd stayed in their comfort, if they'd listened to the voice of fear, and if they'd forgotten God's provision in the past. They would have never set foot in that water. And they would have never learned that God was with them in a living way. So friends, say these words with me. I desire to live a life worthy of God. I desire to live a life worthy of God. Amen.